I'd like to welcome all the members and the public, because this will be televised here, to the first session of our Senate's Distinguished Speakers Forum. And I want to thank the Majority Leader as well as the caucus chair for their help, and my staff, of course, in helping to put this together. This is not unprecedented here. During his time as pro tem, Senator Lockyer, Pro Tem Lockyer, introduced a speaker series designed to discuss the future of the state of California. This year, we want to build on the history of that series. You know, I said it before, members, because of the 30-day in print rule that's in the Constitution, we don't get to hearing bills until March or April. And yet we have all of this time on the floor together. And while it is very important to recognize those who have passed away and of course the guests that come to the Capitol, I think we can also use our time here even more productively, and that's the goal here. And what we want to do is bring speakers who aren't going to discuss a bill or argue about a bill or even, well, we want to talk about the current issues, but more from a long-term historical perspective, both looking backwards but also looking forward. Over the next 2 months, you'll hear from scientists, authors, and policy experts about how we've arrived at this point in California, how the state is changing, and what the future may hold for us. I hope that these discussions will spark some more discussion and maybe inform how and what we choose to focus on as a Senate this year. And we thought to begin, we ought to start with the facts of who we are as a people. Every year, the Legislative Analyst Office releases its so-called Cal Facts report, which is one of the best little pamphlets. I don't mean little in terms of what it means, but it's eminently readable. It provides an overview of our public finance and program trends, everything from health to education to transportation and trade. So we have invited our legislative analyst, Mac Taylor, to talk about the changing demographics of California. And I know it's a little bit of a risk to say who's coming next because we're still trying to schedule, but just so you know, we've invited people like Father Gregory Boyle to talk about youth and gangs, Dr. Sandra Naylor Goodwin to talk about mental health, Jennifer Lynn Siebel to talk about the role of women in California, Dr. Paul Sappho, who is the managing director of Foresight at Discern Analytics and teaches at Stanford University, David Hayes Bautista, who is the director of the Center for Latino Health and Culture at the School of Medicine, UCLA. We're trying to get Amy Tan. So we intend to make these sessions once a week for 1 hour up until we start getting into the bill session, interesting and provocative. And the way we'll do this, we won't have a presiding officer, we'll have Mac, and then we'll do it rather informally. I can kind of recognize members from back here. Feel free to answer questions, and let's have a discussion. We'll see how this works, okay? Thank you. Please welcome Mac Taylor.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's nice to be here today, especially since I can talk about something other than the budget. We've put together a series of charts, and as the Senator said, some of them came from our pamphlet, Cal Facts, which we delivered to your offices earlier this month, and I hope you do find that pamphlet helpful to you. It's basically a state and local finance primer about state spending and revenues, et cetera. But today I was asked to talk a little bit about demographics and the economy. These are really just some snapshots of interesting and I think important features of those two subjects. So let's just kind of go through them. We should start with our population. We've got 38 million Californians now, but it's interesting when you look back over the decades how the growth rates have really differed. This goes back to the 1920s, and it shows the annual growth rate for each of those decades. And you can see back in the first half of the century, of the 19th century, the 20th century, we had growth rates between 4 and 5% in most of those decades, as California was really booming. In the second half of the 20th century, population started to grow at much less rapid rates, about half of that, or 2% a year. And you can see that recently, population in California has now approached the growth rate of the nation as a whole. I don't think that's surprising. As California matures as a state, we are naturally going to slow in our growth rates as we fill out in our urban areas, as immigration is less than it was in the past, both foreign and domestic. So I don't think that's unusual that you've seen that sort of coming together of those trend lines. But at this point, both the United States and California is growing at just over 1% a year. Now, age-wise, if you look at the groupings, I think the only really interesting thing about this chart is what's happening in the younger folks. California is a slightly younger state than the rest of the nation. We have more 0 through 19 and even those under age 40, and then we have less in the other groups. This chart, I think, shows you one of the more significant demographic trends, in my view, over the last couple of decades. These are birth rates by different age group amongst women, and it shows the number of births per thousand in that group. And if you look at that bottom black line, those are, in effect, teen births. And they have dropped dramatically during this time period, well over half just during 2 decades. And I think that's generally a very positive development, as I know this body has tried to take actions in some ways that reduce those teen births, and they have dropped dramatically. Also, if you look at the top 2, relatively young women between the ages of in their 20s have also dropped fairly substantially. And then the only group that has, increased slightly are the 30 to 44, as many women have delayed their childbearing until later on in time. But this has implications, as we'll see, for some of our state expenditures and for the future. It's interesting that if you think about households, we have 12.6 million households in the state, and you can roughly divide them into fourths. First of all, if you look at those households which have a married couple in them, roughly half have at least one child, that is, someone less than 18 years of age. The other half are married households that either have no children, or they may have still have a young adult, in effect, anyone over age 18. But you have married couples, which are about half of the households. You have almost a quarter of households, which are single people living by themselves. And then the remaining fourth, or just over a fourth, are all other combinations. It could be a single parent, it could be an adult with an older parent living with them, or other relatives. Kind of everything else is in that last category. This is population growth by percentage change over the last decade. This can kind of show you where has the growth been concentrated, so that you can see the darker the color, the higher the growth rate. And not surprisingly, you can see that in large part because of the built-out nature of many of our coastal areas and the availability of land in other areas of the state, you see that you've had greater growth in the Central Valley and in the Inland Empire. And you have relatively slow growth along the coastal areas. Now, even slow growth in those coastal areas still translates into a lot of people, because that's where most people do live. A well-known demographic development in the state is the change in our ethnic and racial makeup. And you can see that Hispanics have almost doubled the share of the population over the last 30 years. And the Asian Americans have also more than doubled their share of the population over that time period. And on the other side, the flip side, the proportion of whites and African Americans have declined over that period. This is an interesting chart. This shows density. The darker the blue color, the more people per square mile. And obviously, as we know, that most Californians live on fairly narrow strips of coastal land in the Bay Area and from Santa Barbara down through San Diego. And the other place where you can see is just kind of follow Highway 99 up the valley, and that's where we also have large concentrations of people. Just some interesting facts. California currently has about 239 people per square mile. We're 11th most dense state in the country. In 1900, there were 10 Californians per square mile. That grew in 1950 to 68, and as I said, we're currently at 239. For the average for the country as a whole is about 88 people per square mile. Now, we're the most dense state west of the Mississippi. We'll never be as dense as the eastern states because obviously we have a huge amount of territory which will never be inhabited in our forests and deserts. But we do have some of the most concentrated population centers in the country. If you use what the Census Bureau calls urbanized areas, we have the top 2 densest urbanized areas in the country. Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim, with about 7,000 people per square mile, and the San Francisco-Oakland area, with about 6,200 square people per mile. The most dense urbanized areas in the country. Now, I can't avoid budget implications entirely. This is one of my favorite charts. This shows where we expect the growth in the California's population in this coming decade by age group. And I think you can see pretty easily the implications for many of your budget areas. First of all, that 04, and first of all, this is really reflecting in large part those lower birth rates that we saw earlier. We used to talk about a baby boom and then an echo boom, the kids from the baby boomers, and then the second echo would be occurring about now, but that's been dissipated by this drop in the birth rates. Certainly. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. This is, before you get any further, this is a rather stark indication of the way the state of California is aging, and I'm wondering what your suggestions might be. First of all, whether or not you think that our public policy and our budgeting and so forth is addressing this aging of California, and what you recommend we might do in consideration of that. And then, of course, on the notion that the viability of our economy really rests on those in their prime work years, which would be the 25, perhaps to 64. What do you suggest we might do to try to change this, what seems to be rather disconcerting pattern?
Very good question. I was going to touch on a little bit. Let me just go through the age groups, and I'll try to get to your question, Senator. Again, at the top of the chart, you can see what that might mean for child care, demand for child care services, and at the state level, preschool and child care. It means that while they're still out there, you're not going to see strong growth demands in the coming decade. The 5 through 17, obviously that's your elementary, your K-12. And what that means is that all of the money going to 98, it won't be adjusted for ADA growth. But what is available can go for programs, either maintaining or expanding them, because you're not having to deal on a statewide basis with any growth in that population. Obviously, there's still growing areas of the state that have those concerns. And then on the 18 to 24, that's two things. Primarily, that's your college-age group. And so that means that takes pressure off in the next decade as far as enrollment growth for your three segments. And there again, you can focus on either restoring or making changes to the systems. You're not going to feel the enrollment pressures unless you're able to drastically increase participation rates. And that means, again, that monies can be used in different ways. Now, as the senator noted, a good thing is that you have growth in these two populations, especially in the 45 to 64, which are prime earnings years. That has good implications for the state's revenue system. But to get to the other side here are this dramatic increases in the elderly. The most direct state impacts are on our Medi-Cal program for nursing home cost. But certainly as far as the state's economy is concerned, you can see that on the natural, We're going to have to make sure in our educational system, our community colleges, that we're providing for the kind of healthcare providers and anything related to those aging populations that are just going to be there on the natural. Clearly, these numbers are much more important for the federal level and the whole debate about how we deal with the entitlements that are being provided. This, when people say these things, it just can't continue in its current path, it's because you have these people which will be coming into their earning periods within the next decade or so, and you have lesser of them to support a growing number of people who are aging. That's fundamentally the federal government's problem and why we're talking about entitlements. Let me shift just quickly to a few charts.
Yeah, if I could just ask a question in terms of the pension obligations of basically what we're looking at are the baby boomers, it looks like, going to retirement. And it's a big debate and a big challenge that we have here in the legislature, but what about the obligation about setting money aside for the future, making sure that we're satisfying those obligations, and then, of course, the competing interests for those dollars, especially in the future years as our budget looks like it's going to go into a surplus mode?
Well, in part, the reason for those large unfunded liabilities that the governor identified in the budget, and we've been talking about for several years, this has really explained the numbers behind that of why they're so large. And I think it speaks to how absolutely important it is for the state to fund its obligations as they accrue. So, for example, now in our state retiree health costs, we're still on a pay-as-you-go system. We're not paying for them as they accrue. And if we don't get control of those unfunded liabilities, they can really get away from us because of these underlying demographics. So it's important not only that we start doing what we should have been doing all along, which is pay for those as we accrue them, but we're going to have to start addressing some of those unfunded liabilities before they kind of get out of hand. Let me switch just briefly to a few charts on the economy. This is one just shows if we were a separate nation, we would be 9th in the world, the size of our economy, $2 trillion. We're about 1/8 of the whole United States GDP. I'm sorry, Senator, did you have a? Okay. So we're currently ranked 9th. I was kidding around with my staff. There was talk about if Scotland would only secede from the United Kingdom, we might be able to overtake them. And we've got our eyes on Italy. But California is ranked anywhere between 7th and 9th over the last decade or so. But obviously, the state by itself is an economic powerhouse.
Quick question.
Yes, Senator.
We're number 9, yet 10 years ago we were number 5.
Well, I don't remember us being quite that high, but we were higher.
We were high. What happened?
Yeah, I think as Senator Leno's suggesting, it really depends on which year you pick. And if you were at that was really the peak before we had the dot-com bust. And if you started at year 2000, we've had 2 obviously very difficult downturns in our economy. And that could easily explain why we dropped. And it could also explain why on the upside, if the economy were to recover on the natural, we could move back up to 8th or 7th. This is a mix of our jobs by sector. These are federal categories. And this is the federal, in other words, the shares of jobs that, say, for example, in trade and transportation utilities, that's almost 1/5 of the jobs in the country. Those are any retail or wholesale job, a department store, or anybody sort of selling goods. And it's a big part of the economy. Similarly, financial activities down towards the bottom is banking, real estate, insurance. And these are the federal shares. Now, let's compare them with California's shares. And you can roughly see that California is a very well-diversified economy. And there's 3 areas where we actually have higher shares of jobs. One is in professional and business services. These can be computer design jobs. They can be lawyers, architects, consultants, accountants. These are typically high-paying jobs, and it's a good sector to have a high proportion in. Similarly, we are very high, higher than the U.S. average in leisure and hospitality. This is restaurants, tourism, entertainment-related jobs. And information is kind of an interesting category. That's basically media, movies, and also telecom. And we have a higher proportion there, too. Yes, Senator?
Can you talk about the manufacturing piece a lot? Because that's often talked about here in California and in our legislature. We're fairly close to the national average here, maybe a little bit behind. Can you give us a little qualitative description of that?
Yeah, and actually, let me get to the next couple of charts, Senator, and then if I don't answer your question, please get back to me. So anyway, I think the message, though, is that as big an economy as we have, we're well diversified. We know we're not dependent, as some states are, on largely on one large industry, such as Michigan was with the car industry and car-related. So we're well diversified in that sense. Now, you ask about what's happened in the last couple of decades in the change in jobs. And this is taking some of those categories that we just talked about and what has happened in each of those sectors. Now, the state as a whole over that time period, we had about a 14% increase in jobs. And you can see on the negative, manufacturing declined by about 38%. Now, it's really important, that mirrors the trend nationally. They also, the U.S. as a whole, lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. It was probably more pronounced in California because of what happened in the early 1990s when our aerospace industry was pretty much decimated. Those are all manufacturing jobs. So our fall off was more significant than the nation as a whole, but the underlying trends are for manufacturing jobs. They've been in decline, both in the nation and California. You can see, though, that we've had very strong growth in education and health service. Education means private educational service, not government-related. But this ballgame is all in health services. And obviously, that's an industry that will continue to grow because of those demographics. But also, we have good strength in our professional and business services, as we talked about, and in our tourism and restaurants. Government has grown about the same as the overall growth in state, although it probably grew faster in the first 15 years of this period and has taken some hits in the most recent years.
Mr. Taylor?
Yes, sir.
Would manufacturing be one of those pathways for the lower to go to the middle class?
The question was,
Would the loss of the manufacturing jobs be a reason why the middle class is so impacted?
Well, certainly the loss of manufacturing jobs was a key way in which people, say without as much education, had progressed into really good-paying jobs. But I don't think it's our future. I'm not writing off manufacturing by any means, but this is a high-cost state as far as land is concerned, and things can be produced more cheaply in other places. And so I would suggest that our future is in things like professional and business services, and obviously health services, our tourism, financial services. Those may be the pathways for people to move into those good-paying jobs. Now, just looking more recently about what's happened, let's look at the impact on jobs of the recession. These show the changes, primarily losses in jobs, because the state lost about 1.5 million jobs. More than almost a tenth of our workforce we lost in this Great Recession. And these are just numbers. These are not percentages. So even though construction is at the top there, if you remember from the other chart, the construction is not a huge part, job-wise. It's a crucial part. They lost a huge part. We lost a very high proportion of construction jobs in this state. The only area to gain, again, interesting, was this health services. Now, this takes it from the peak, our last job peak, down to the very bottom. And now as we're rebounding, let's look at what's happened, where have the jobs come back. Those are the light blue bars. And you can see for most sectors, we are gaining jobs. We have recouped a good portion, but still have a long ways to go just to get back to the job peak that we were at. And where we haven't done very well, because you can barely see it, is in construction. Really haven't gained back that many jobs. manufacturing, we haven't gained back very many, and government, again, because of the last 3 years, lots of reductions in schools. Senator.
The professional and I think business services,
Yes.
that the whole IT tech world, Silicon Valley.
It's some of it. It's computer design. Oh, the question was, what is in professional and business services? And it has some consumer design, design aspects, but computers are split up into lots of different categories, but it's more the professional people that would have done software design. It's architects, consultants, accountants, legal, lawyers, things like that.
The only reason I say is you hear that, you read in newspapers how the Bay Area is really moving forward, obviously with Silicon Valley, but it's sort of kind of the tale of two states between, I think, manufacturing and the sort of higher-end IT world. That's going gangbusters, and a lot of folks are still being left behind.
Well, I think that's true, and you can see here that you have large sectors that are still haven't made much ground since we hit bottom, but that's clearly one of our strengths. And it's not just in the Bay Area. Obviously, the San Diego, the Los Angeles area, those are jobs that I think will be distributed more widely in the future because a lot of them don't have to be place-specific.
Senator Nielsen had a question.
Mac, which of your categories would agriculture fit in there? I'm trying to discern. Trade, transportation, utilities, you don't have them broken out.
Yes, it's interesting because a lot of economic data is usually non-farm because of the volatility in the numbers. So this wouldn't have a lot of agricultural jobs unless it was in food processing, for example. Those would be in manufacturing.
Okay. I thank you. And just a historical tidbit, it's not often that small towns get any notoriety at all around here. Mac Taylor and I and our former colleague Pashigian all come from the small town of Sanger.
Sanger, just outside of Fresno. Obviously, trade is a really important aspect of our economy. We produce a lot of stuff, and our markets are overseas in many ways. And this just shows you who we ship to in 2011. Asia being far and away the largest region that we shipped our products, followed by Europe, Mexico, Canada. If you were just talking about individual countries, our biggest export market is Mexico, followed by Canada, China, and Japan. Now, what do we export? Those are the big products, computer and electronics. This could be chips or any other type of product like that. Building materials, whether it's lumber or other things. And of course, agriculture here, senators, where it shows up. Obviously, we feed not only a lot of the United States, especially fruits and nuts, vegetables. We dominate markets in many products, but we ship a lot of those, rice, almonds, to other nations. Those are really growing markets for us.
Mr. Taylor,
Yes, sir.
would computers, electronics, machinery, equipment, transportation, isn't it all a product of manufacturing?
Much of that would be, yes. The question is, are those the products of manufacturing?
I'm trying to correlate back to the prior chart that said manufacturing we're decreasing in manufacturing, and yet these are the main exports, which are all manufacturing. So my thought is, are we really, hurting our major economic base in California by having lost in those manufacturing jobs and therefore the base of California's economy?
Again, I think it's kind of a mixed story. Again, these are just absolute dollars, where those other charts were changes. Clearly, the computers and electronics reflects our strong edge in information, that information sector, and our educational system. It's what allows you to both design and, in many cases, manufacture aspects here. But your question's a good one, though.
Is this a sick code, then, interpretation of what is what?
There's some of that is at a coding of how it's called the NAICS code now, of how they just put people in different things. But there is something very fundamental about it as far as a lot of manufacturing. If it's not, for example, agricultural specific, we would process a lot of foods here. Well, we used to do even more of that, but a lot of foods would be both processed and they would be manufactured here. And that's going to stay here. Our computers still should be strong. Other types of manufacturing is likely not to be as strong in the future. I think it's just as a share of our economy, it's likely to decrease over time as it has for the nation.
Getting to Senator Craig's point a little more specifically, this counterintuitive fact of our losing such a percentage of our manufacturing jobs in the same 30-month period that we were having year-to-year record levels of manufacturing for 30 consecutive months. That changed just recently, but we were having year-to-year record export records for 30 months straight.
Well, again, I'm not sure of the exact, I don't know if it's just going off a much lower base, though, Senator, so I'd have to check with you on that. But it's very clear that as a share of our economy, manufacturing will probably continue to decline slowly.
Mr. Taylor?
Yes.
Given that a lot of the manufacturing is now in the Asian theater, and given the exchange rates may change, meaning the yuan may go up in value versus the dollar, just in time becoming more integral part of manufacturing, would those help our manufacturing? Is that already assumed in your analysis?
That's far too subtle for what we assumed at these charts, Senator, but it's a good question. I'm not sure I'm expert enough to answer that one. Senator Hill, did you? No. The last chart is one that I found pretty powerful in describing to groups why we've been in such a world of hurt the last 4 years. This takes some of the data we've talked about, but it shows for the last 4 recessions the job loss. If you go down the chart, it's the percentage of jobs we lost from our peak to the very bottom of the recession. And you can see this is our most recent recession, and we lost over about 9% of our jobs, which is 3 times as much as any prior to the 3 recessions. That just shows you how deep the effect of the so-called Great Recession was on employment in the state, and why we have been struggling so hard in the last 4 years to try to get our budget back in balance. We just lost a huge chunk of our economy in a relatively short period of time. And then if you'll see across the top of the page, going from left to right, those are the number of years we're projecting it will take before we get back to the level of jobs that we had at the peak. Thank you. At the peak in 2007. And you can see we're looking at 7.5 years, which would be about 2015, somewhere right in there, before we just get back to the level of jobs we had in 2007. That's a very long recovery period. And that's, again, why we're still struggling now, because while the economy is growing, it's growing at a fairly moderate pace. Senator?
Thank you. I think that begs the question, how did you factor the length of time, and what has delayed our ability to rebound as robustly, or I guess maybe not robustly, but as we have in the past? What are the factors that enter into that estimate of 7.5 years, and what are the reasons for it?
I think there's 2 main reasons. The first, that we had such a big hit, it on the natural will take a lot of time to get back. You can see the shape of the kind of curve there, that V or U. It's not that much different from prior recessions, but because it's so deep, it just takes us a longer time to get back. But I think there's a little more at work there. I think that the housing bubble, and I didn't have a chart on that, we had such a huge housing bubble. I think with Arizona, Nevada, Florida, those 4 states, we were hit incredibly hard by the whole meltdown in the financial markets and the housing markets. And we're still kind of slowly recuperating from that. And that's sort of put a damper on the kind of growth that you otherwise typically would see in a recession, where when you bounce back some years, you can get 8–10% growth in your personal income. We're generally forecasting 5%, considerably less coming out of recovery. If you go back to these recoveries, you had some really, really fast growth, bounce back. And we're just not seeing that. But I think it's for factors like that.
How has the housing bubble had that impact? Are you factoring in construction, or people who've lost their homes?
All of that. The fact that you probably remember in our chart on construction growth, it still hasn't bounced back much. because you had to work through all of those homes before builders are willing to go out and take a chance on building new homes, new product.
Has the housing economy been so significant in California? Has it been a major player, to the point where we see this dramatic fall off from the other recessions?
It's been a big player at the margin. Even if you look at the size of it, it's not like it's a huge piece like trade was or educational, but at the margin, it's much more volatile. Both on the upside, when we're having really good years, housing can contribute a lot, because when you build a new house, you obviously employ a lot of people, use a lot of products, and then the person goes in the house and they typically buy new appliances, and you get this huge sort of thrust of economic growth. Unfortunately, it acts just the same on the downside. It can magnify your problems. So clearly construction has not given us the kind of bounce back that it has in the past, but still could as we maybe pick up a little steam, hopefully. With that, Senator, that concludes the slideshow.
Are there any other questions? The final exam will be Thursday at 8:30. Essay, multiple choice. No, look, this is a little bit of an experiment, but I really appreciate it, Mac. I think it's very, very informative and information that is easy to gloss over unless we focus on it. And we'll try to keep these sessions like this relatively short, but we'll make them valuable, and I appreciate the members' active participation. Thank you very much.